On the night of my 18th birthday, the cabin felt wrong in a way I could not explain, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I had grown up in that old wooden place tucked into the pines outside Flagstaff, and I knew every creak of the floorboards and every draft that slipped under the window frames. But that night, everything felt unfamiliar, staged, almost rehearsed. My father Derek was being too pleasant, smiling too wide, and offering to warm up the stew he never cooked. My grandfather Raymond sat in his chair in the corner, unusually silent, his eyes always drifting back to me like he was measuring something. My brother Ethan paced near the kitchen doorway, jittery and sharp around the edges the way he always was when he was hiding something. The whole scene felt like a birthday party in a house where no one liked each other, which was nothing new, but there was a strange energy underneath it that I could not name. I tried to brush it off as nerves because turning 18 was supposed to feel big, but the feeling only grew heavier with each minute. While everyone distracted themselves setting out plates and mumbling half-hearted wishes, my 7-year-old niece Ella tugged suddenly at the sleeve of my sweater. Her tiny hand was shaking. Before I could ask what was wrong, she pulled me toward the narrow hallway bathroom and shut the door behind us, her breathing quick and uneven. I knelt so we were eye to eye and brushed her hair back from her damp forehead. She looked terrified in a way that made my own heart stumble. She leaned close until her lips were almost at my ear and whispered in a trembling voice that I will never forget for as long as I live. "Be careful tonight, Auntie. Grandpa said you will not wake up tomorrow." Dad agreed. They were talking in the garage while the loud machine was on. They thought I could not hear. For a moment, I could not move. Her words slid into my skin like a cold blade. I pulled back to look at her face, hoping she had misunderstood, hoping this was a nightmare she had invented from living around too many angry men. But her eyes were wide and wet and honest in the way only a child's eyes can be. I swallowed hard and tried to keep my voice steady as I asked her what she heard, exactly where she was, and why she had been near the garage. Through small sobs, Ella explained that she had been searching for her cat Peanut, who liked hiding behind the shed. The back door of the garage had been cracked open. Inside the rototiller, or maybe the generator had been running so loudly that the whole ground vibrated. She had stepped closer because she thought Peanut might be inside, and she heard Grandpa and her father speaking over the noise. She said they talked louder than normal because they assumed no one could hear them. She remembered a few words clearly. Debt, club, tonight. She will not know what hit her. Each word fell heavier inside me. I wanted to tell her she misunderstood that adults sometimes say strange things when they are stressed, but I had grown up in this family. Violence had always been a quiet language here. I had seen my father shove my mother into a wall before pretending it never happened. I had seen my grandfather drag my sister Sophie across the floor by her hair. I had seen Ethan punch holes in the door while Sophie cried on the other side, and I had seen the police walk away every time because nothing left enough bruises to count. My mother had died in this cabin a few years earlier in what everyone insisted was an accident. She slipped in the bathroom, they said. She hit her head, they said. But even then, something had felt wrong to me. Now every old suspicion was waking up like a monster stretching after sleep. I hugged Ella tight and told her she did the right thing by telling me. My hands were cold, my breath shallow. When we stepped out of the bathroom, I tried to look normal. Tried to smile when Derek slid a plate of cake toward me, but my mind was spinning. While they argued about candles and who forgot to buy ice cream, I walked past the hallway and toward the side window that faced the garage. The cold Arizona night pressed against the glass. The moon lit the clearing just enough that I could see the garage door was slightly ajar. A thin line of yellow light spilled onto the dirt. I moved quietly beneath the window frame, my pulse hammering, and leaned close enough to see through the small crack in the warped wood paneling. Derek and Raymond stood shoulder to shoulder inside their heads bent toward each other. Their voices were low, but a few words carried. "Tonight is the night. She is finally 18. The club gets what they want, and we clear the debt." My stomach twisted so sharply I had to grip the windowsill to keep from falling. It was real. Ella had not imagined anything. They were planning something involving me, something that would happen tonight. I stepped back from the window, my heart crashing against my ribs, the truth settling into me like a weight that could break bone. I was not safe in my own home. And for the first time in my life, I understood that if I wanted to live past my 18th birthday, I would have to find a way out before midnight. People in town always said our family looked strong and close, the kind of hard-working American family that kept to themselves and minded their business, the kind that lived simply in a beautiful old cabin tucked between tall pines and red dirt roads. For as long as I can remember, neighbors smiled at my father Derek like he was some dedicated blue-collar man fighting to provide for his children. They waved respectfully at my grandfather Raymond because he had the posture of a man who once ran things around here, a man with stories about hunting elk and fixing roofs and surviving winters that froze pipes solid. They nodded at my brother Ethan because he was handsome in his rough way and talked about hard work and loyalty like he invented the concepts. From the outside, we looked like tradition, grit, and stability. But every family who shines too much on the outside usually has something rotting on the inside, and ours had been rotting for decades. Derek was charming when he wanted to be, especially in front of cameras, church members, or people who owed him favors. Behind closed doors, he was an unpredictable drunk who could switch from a calm whisper to a violent shove without warning. He slammed cupboards, punched walls, and threw accusations at my mother until she stopped speaking back. He blamed his drinking on stress or money or the pressure of raising 2 kids, but the truth was, violence made him feel powerful. Raymond was worse in a colder way. He believed women were property and repeated that belief in small comments that felt harmless until you saw what they built over time. He liked control more than anything. When I was 13, he snapped at my sister Sophie for wanting to go to a school dance, grabbed her by the arm, and told her Mitchell women do not parade themselves. When Sophie refused to back down, he pulled her by the hair into the hallway and locked her in her room for hours. I remember crying and begging him to open the door while he smoked on the porch like nothing happened. Ethan grew up watching all of this. He absorbed it the way kids absorb everything around them. By the time he turned 17, he was already mirroring Derek's temper. When he married Sophie at 19, he promised her he was different, but everyone in our family knew promises meant nothing here. He hit her for the first time a year later. By 23, he had bruised her ribs twice and smashed her phone after she tried to call the police. She left him with baby Ella after the 3rd hospitalization, and even though she escaped, Ethan blamed her forever. He never forgave her for taking Ella away, saying Sophie had broken the family. None of them ever forgave any woman for leaving. My mother had been the only soft place in the whole house. She loved us fiercely and tried to shield us, but she was outnumbered and outmatched by 3 generations of men who believed authority belonged to them alone. She always smelled like lavender lotion and warm bread, and she hummed when she cooked because she said it kept the fear away. She planned to take me and Sophie to live with her sister in Phoenix. I heard her arguing with Derek about it the week before she died. She said she could not let us grow up in a house ruled by fists and threats. Derek told her she was being dramatic. Raymond told her she was disrespecting her husband. Ethan told her she was poisoning the family with lies. A week later, she slipped in the bathroom. That was the official story. But no one had ever slipped in that bathroom before. And she was planning to leave, and the bruise on her temple did not look like something from a fall. I was 15, and I remember sitting at her funeral with a knot in my throat so big I could barely breathe, feeling like everyone around me had agreed to pretend her death made sense. Even Sophie whispered to me that something felt off. But the police accepted the accident explanation. No one pushed harder. Women in families like ours rarely had their stories investigated. After Mom died, responsibility in the cabin shifted in a way that made me feel like a ghost in my own home. I became the one who cleaned, cooked, babysat Ella when Sophie dropped her off and kept the house running while the men drank, argued, and spent money we did not have. Derek sank deeper into gambling. At first it was harmless bets at the local bar, but he lost control fast. I overheard him yelling once about losing too much at a poker night run by the local biker group and how he just needed time to win it back. Raymond stepped in not to stop him, but to say he knew people in that club from his younger days and could negotiate. That made things worse. Suddenly there were men in leather jackets showing up in our driveway at odd hours. They spoke to Raymond in low voices. Derek began slipping out late at night. Ethan's temper worsened, like he felt important just by being around them. Everyone denied involvement when I asked. They laughed it off or told me to mind my own business, but the more I watched, the more I saw signs of panic beneath their bravado. Derek drank more. Ethan looked over his shoulder constantly. Raymond kept a shotgun loaded near the door. Money disappeared from the house. And the strangest shift of all was how intensely they watched me as my 18th birthday approached, like they were waiting for something. I had noticed Derek bringing home envelopes of cash that disappeared within days. I heard him telling Raymond that the club wanted things done their way. I heard Raymond mutter that girls turn 18 and then become useful. At the time, I did not understand what that meant. I thought they were just being crude. I did not think they were capable of what Ella overheard. But as I stood there that night thinking about the garage conversation, she described the fake smiles at my birthday dinner and the strange way my family had been behaving. Everything that once seemed like scattered pieces clicked into a clear and horrifying picture. The mask my family wore for the world was slipping, and what lay beneath it was darker than anything I had ever imagined. The truth was that the men in my house were not providers or protectors. They were men who believed survival always came at someone else's expense. Tonight, that someone else was me. After the shock of Ella's whisper began to settle into something sharper and colder, I pulled her into my bedroom and shut the door quietly, praying none of the men heard the click. My hands were trembling when I knelt down again. I tried to keep my voice calm, even though my heartbeat felt like it was scraping against my ribs. I asked her to tell me everything she heard, every word, every sound, every detail. She rubbed her eyes with the back of her small hand and took a shaky breath. She said she had been outside earlier just before dinner looking for Peanut because he liked hiding under the shed when it got cold. She walked around to the side of the cabin and heard the rototiller rumbling inside the garage. She thought someone had left it running by accident, so she peeked through the half-open back door to see if Peanut was inside. The machine was so loud that she had to cover her ears. She thought no one would hear her because the noise shook the whole ground. That was when she heard voices rising over the engine, not yelling but speaking louder than normal. She recognized Grandpa's voice first because of his gravelly tone. She recognized her father's voice next. They sounded serious and irritated. She remembered Grandpa saying the word debt, saying something about the club, and then saying tonight like it was some kind of deadline. Ella said she heard the line, "She will not know what hit her," before the machine drowned out the rest. I felt myself freeze when she said that. It echoed the same way it had echoed in my mind since she first whispered it in the bathroom, and hearing it again stripped away any hope that she had misheard. I asked her where exactly she stood, what they were facing, and whether they noticed her. She insisted they could not have seen her because the machine was facing away from the door and they had their backs turned while leaning over a workbench. The noise was violent enough that it masked everything else. She said she tiptoed away as soon as she felt scared. Listening to her, I kept thinking how children never lie about the things that truly terrify them. They might exaggerate when they want attention, but fear makes them brutally honest. And the fear in Ella's face was something I could not dismiss. I held her close until she calmed down, then told her to stay in my room no matter what and not to leave unless I came back for her. When I stepped out, the smell of stew and cigarette smoke hit me in a wave. The men were all still in the kitchen pretending to celebrate. Derek was lighting a candle for the cake, humming off key, acting like everything was perfectly normal. He never hummed unless he was hiding stress. Raymond sat with his arms crossed, tapping his boot against the wood floor, staring at the flickering birthday candle with an expression that looked almost impatient. Ethan was shoveling food into Ella's empty plate as if to cover up the fact she had been missing for several minutes. He kept glancing at the hallway, his jaw twitching each time he looked away. I took my seat slowly, trying not to draw attention to the fact my stomach was twisted into knots. Derek lifted his glass of cheap whiskey and grinned at me. He said, "Here is to new beginnings," in a tone that was too smooth for a man who normally barked his words. Something about the way he said new beginnings made my skin pull tight across my bones. Raymond lifted his glass right after and nodded toward me with a look that felt like ownership rather than affection. Ethan did not raise his glass. He just said, "Yeah, sure, whatever," and kept his hand on the back of Ella's empty chair like he needed to keep track of her. I stared at their faces one by one and felt the last thread of denial inside me finally snap. They were planning something. They were preparing for it. And I needed more than Ella's overheard fragments. I needed proof. I needed to know exactly what I was running from. While they started slicing cake and arguing about who forgot the lighter fluid for the grill earlier, I excused myself with a shaky smile and said I needed to grab a sweater. No one paid attention because Derek had started telling a story about winning a bet years ago. I moved down the hallway, careful with every step. When I reached the window that faced the garage, I leaned slightly and listened. The rototiller had been shut off. The night was quiet except for the trees brushing against each other. I could not hear voices now, but that only made me more anxious. They had spoken freely earlier because of the machine's noise. That meant they were careful now. I went back to my room and sat beside Ella. She watched me with wide eyes, waiting for something I did not know how to give her yet. Instead of reassurance, I gave her honesty. I told her she did the right thing. I told her she was brave. I told her we would figure out what to do. But inside, panic was building. The first warning had arrived, and it had come from the only person in that cabin who had no reason to lie. That alone made it more terrifying than anything I had heard in years. The longer I sat beside Ella in that dim bedroom, the more my mind began drifting through every memory I had spent years trying to bury each one, resurfacing with a clarity that made my skin crawl. Violence had always been stitched into the seams of my family's history, so familiar and constant that for most of my childhood I mistook it for normal life. I remembered being 8 years old, standing in the kitchen with a glass of milk when a sudden crash made me jump. My mother had been reaching for a pan when Derek shoved her because she disagreed with him about money. She hit the counter hard and tried to laugh it off, saying she slipped, but I saw the way she flinched each time he raised his hand afterward. I remembered being 10 and hearing Raymond tell Sophie she was acting like a wild animal because she wanted to go to a dance. His voice was deep and calm in that terrifying way he used when he believed he was teaching someone a lesson. When she stood up for herself, he grabbed her hair at the roots and dragged her down the hallway as she screamed, and no one in the house stopped him. Derek yelled at her to quit making a scene. Ethan watched with a kind of hungry fascination, absorbing it all like it was a blueprint. By the time Ethan was a teenager, he had already learned that intimidation got him whatever he wanted. I remembered him slamming Sophie's bedroom door so hard, the frame cracked when she refused to skip school to watch Ella so he could go drink with his friends. When she finally left him years later, face swollen and ribs bruised, he told everyone she was hysterical and ungrateful. And the family believed him because our family always believed the men first, no matter how much blood or fear or desperation the women showed. I remembered the day Mom died more vividly than any moment in my life. Sophie and I were sitting on the couch doing homework when we heard a loud thud from the bathroom, followed by silence, so complete it felt like the whole world paused. Derek yelled her name with this strange mixture of annoyance and fear. We ran down the hallway and found him crouched next to her on the tile floor. Her hair was wet, her face pale, her eyes half open. There was a bruise on her temple, shaped in a way that did not match the sink or the counter. Raymond arrived seconds later and told us to stay back. He said accidents happen especially on slippery floors. Later, when the sheriff came, Derek cried into his hands and said he loved her more than life. The sheriff patted his back and told him he was sorry for his loss. No one questioned the bruise. No one questioned why my mother had been packing a suitcase the night before. No one questioned why she told me just days earlier that she had been saving money and that we might be leaving soon. But I questioned it. I questioned it for years. I questioned why the only person who ever tried to soften this house had disappeared the same week she challenged the rules that Derek and Raymond enforced like law. I questioned why every female member of our family had scars that no one talked about. Sophie had a chipped tooth from Ethan. My Aunt Ruth Raymond's sister had a broken wrist that she called a fall down the stairs, even though the stairs were carpeted. My grandmother left Ray years before I was born and never spoke to him again. She lived in a tiny apartment in Phoenix and died alone. The only thing she mailed to Mom before passing was a letter that said some men are born believing the world belongs to them and those men will always try to make you smaller. I was too young to understand it then, but I understood it now. Violence was the only inheritance passed down in the Mitchell family. It was taught, defended, normalized, and hidden. It lived in our walls, in our conversations, in our silence. Even our cabin seemed built to contain it, with its thick wooden beams and sound-absorbing floors that swallowed screams. My mother used to whisper to me at night that intuition is a kind of alarm system God gives girls to keep them alive. She told me if something ever felt wrong, I should trust it even when everyone else told me not to. She told me that one day I would understand why she said those things. Sitting there with Ella trembling beside me, I finally understood. My family did not simply have a history of anger. They had a legacy of domination. They believed control was theirs by right, and women existed to absorb their rage, to carry their burdens, and to stay quiet while doing it. And once a woman stopped complying, she became disposable. My mother tried to leave and died. Sophie left and was chased by threats for years. Now I was 18. Now I was legal. Now I was valuable in whatever deal they were arranging. And they had no reason to keep me alive afterward. The pattern was too clear to ignore. It was not bad luck. It was not coincidence. It was a cycle that I had stepped directly into and that Ella had unknowingly uncovered. Violence was not an unfortunate accident in our family. It was tradition, and knowing that meant the danger Ella overheard was not a misunderstanding. It was a promise. The shift in my family had not happened overnight, but looking back, I could trace every change to the moment Derek's gambling slipped from barroom bets into something far more dangerous. When I was around 16, he started coming home with his knuckles bruised and the sour smell of fear mixed with cheap whiskey on his breath. At first, he blamed the long hours on construction sites or fights with strangers, but I overheard enough whispered phone calls to know he had fallen in with a local biker group that operated across the back roads around Flagstaff. Everyone in town knew they were more than hobby riders. They were connected to a small cartel network that trafficked weapons, drugs, and occasionally people. They were not the kind of men you made casual mistakes with. For months, Derek insisted he was just playing cards with them, but I remembered the night he stumbled into the cabin with blood on his shirt and told Raymond something about losing too much and needing time to fix it. Raymond closed the door behind them before I could hear more, but his voice carried through the walls as he told Derek he should have come to him sooner. Raymond bragged constantly about his old connections, about how he used to run with tough crowds and how his name still meant something. I had never believed him, thinking it was just another inflated story from a man who liked to relive the parts of his past that made him feel powerful. But then I saw the way Derek stared at him with desperate eyes that night, and the way Raymond straightened his shoulders as if he felt important again. It made sense in a grim way. The men in my family always performed best when someone else's fear made them feel big. After that night, I noticed strangers showing up at our cabin more often. Men in leather jackets who spoke in short-clipped sentences. Men who looked at me too long before shifting their attention back to Derek. Men who called Raymond old man in a tone that was half mocking and half respectful. One evening I heard Derek arguing on the porch. He said the words interest deadline and do not give me that price. Another night, Ethan came home late smelling like gasoline and adrenaline. He said he went riding with some guys from town, but I saw the dust on his jeans and the way his hands shook slightly, like he had either done something he should not have or seen something he could not forget. When I asked what happened, he snapped at me with this strange confidence, as if he had become someone else entirely. He kept saying I did what I had to do for our family. That sentence haunted me long before I understood what he meant. As the months passed, the tension in the house grew thicker. Money disappeared faster. Tools vanished from the shed. The men fought more, drank more, whispered more. Derek stopped going to work for a while and kept saying he would fix everything once the right opportunity came. Raymond reassured him that the club respected strength and loyalty and that he had handled worse situations in the past. Ethan kept repeating that Dad always finds a way out, but the panic in his eyes betrayed him. Then about a week before my 18th birthday, I overheard Derek and Ethan arguing in the kitchen. Their voices were low but sharp, like two men trying not to wake a sleeping monster. Ethan said, "You are the one who owes them, not me," and Derek snapped back that the debt belonged to the whole family now. Ethan said the cartel side of the club was getting involved and that they were not going to wait much longer. Derek told him they needed something of value to offer and that he had already talked to Grandpa. Ethan went silent after that, and for the first time I heard fear in my brother's voice rather than anger. Later that afternoon, I went to take out the trash and saw a crumpled piece of paper sticking out of the bin. Curiosity made me pull it out even though I knew I should not touch anything Derek discarded. The paper was torn and smudged, but I could read enough to feel my stomach turn. It said payment, Mitchell family 18 birthday midnight cabin. The letters were uneven, like someone had scrawled it in a hurry or with shaking hands. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than a coincidence or some misinterpreted note from a different job or a different family. But deep down, I knew. I knew because the men in my family had been watching me more closely as the date approached. I knew because Derek had been talking about debts like they were obligations written in stone. I knew because Raymond kept repeating that a girl becomes independent at 18 and that independence sometimes comes at a cost. And I knew because Ella had heard them in the garage that night speaking freely over the roar of the machine, planning something that involved me directly. Everything pointed toward the same horrifying truth. Whatever they owed the club, whatever desperation had pushed them into this corner, they believed offering me was a solution. They believed my 18th birthday meant I could be handed over without questions, without witnesses, without legal complications. I was old enough to disappear without raising suspicion. I was old enough to become payment. When I realized all of that, something inside me cracked. The shift had happened. The line between family and danger had been crossed, and I understood with absolute certainty that my only chance at survival was figuring out how much time I had left before midnight. The moment the truth settled into me like a weight I could hardly carry. My body reacted before my mind did. I stood from the bed so quickly that Ella flinched, though she tried to hide it. I told her to stay there and lock the door behind me, to only open it when she heard my voice, and she nodded with trembling urgency. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, the cabin felt tighter, the walls closer, the air heavier. Every light seemed too dim, every shadow too sharp. I moved as quietly as I could, forcing myself not to run, even though my pulse was sprinting. My first instinct was to get out through the front door, call for help, flag down a passing car, anything that would put distance between me and the men who were planning to trade me like a piece of property. When I reached the living room, Derek was standing near the fireplace with a beer in his hand, humming the same fake, cheerful tune he used when he wanted to seem harmless. He glanced at me, smiled too widely, and said he hoped I was enjoying my birthday. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, but there was something sharp underneath that smile. Something that watched me too closely. I said I needed some air, that I was going to step outside for a moment. He nodded as if he did not care, but his gaze followed me to the entryway like a leash. I wrapped my hand around the doorknob, turned it slowly, and felt my stomach drop when it refused to budge. The door was locked from the outside. At first, I thought it was rust or one of the old quirks of the cabin, but then I saw the metal latch freshly secured, the kind that could only be tightened from the porch. Derek noticed my hesitation and casually mentioned that the wind had been blowing the door open earlier, so he had secured it. His voice was too relaxed. His lie was too soft. I let go of the doorknob and stepped back, pretending to accept the explanation. My mind raced through every alternative exit. The windows were old but reinforced after a break-in years ago. The back sliding door led to the deck, but it creaked loudly and was always guarded by the eyes of anyone sitting in the kitchen. I decided to try the back door anyway, hoping for a miracle. When I walked toward the kitchen, Raymond was sitting at the table, sharpening his pocket knife on a strip of leather. The scrape of metal filled the room with a slow, steady rhythm that made me shiver. He looked up when I approached, his gaze lingering on my face like he was studying it for signs of fear. I forced myself to ask if the back door was unlocked, claiming I heard something outside earlier and wanted to check. He narrowed his eyes, then said he had been sitting there the entire evening and had not heard a thing. His tone made it clear the conversation was over. I stepped past him anyway, pretending not to notice the tension, and reached for the sliding door handle. Before I could pull it open, Raymond said, "If you are going out there, you should take a coat. It is cold." His voice was low, almost kind, but the emphasis on "if" made every muscle in my body clench. I turned to face him and saw the shotgun propped casually against the wall behind his chair. It had not been there earlier. My breath caught in my throat. He was sitting guard. Not guarding the house, but guarding me. I muttered something about grabbing my coat from my room and backed away slowly. When I passed the hallway, Ethan came inside from the porch wiping his boots. He looked surprised to see me out of my room and asked where Ella was in a clipped tone that made my spine stiffen. I lied and said she was lying down because she ate too much cake. His expression softened for a moment, but then he blocked the hallway as if he wanted to make sure I was not going anywhere else. Panic began to claw through me. Every path had been sealed. Every movement was watched. I needed another plan. I needed something they would not expect. I walked calmly into the living room again, pretending to look for my phone, hoping none of them could see how badly my hands were shaking. As soon as I was sure they were distracted by a new argument about the money they owed, I slipped toward the laundry room where a small side window faced the woods behind the cabin. It was old, painted shut, nearly impossible to open, but I had to try. I pushed until my palms ached, but it did not move more than an inch. My throat tightened. My eyes burned. It was suddenly so clear. I was trapped. And they had planned it that way. Every escape route was blocked. Every exit was watched. Midnight was coming, and now the cabin felt less like a home and more like a cage. The moment I accepted that every exit had been sealed, something inside me hardened in a way I had never felt before. A cold clarity that pushed me toward the only option left, which was uncovering the full truth before it was too late. If I could not escape yet, I needed information leverage, something that would give me even the smallest advantage. I waited near the laundry room doorway until the men's voices rose again in the kitchen, thick with alcohol and frustration. Derek yelled something about respect and deadlines, while Ethan snapped back that he never agreed to this, though the wobble in his voice made it sound more like he was trying to convince himself than anyone else. Raymond's gravelly tone cut through both of them, telling them to shut their mouths and remember what was at stake. Their argument gave me the distraction I needed. I slipped down the hallway, keeping close to the wall so the floorboards would not creak beneath my weight. When I reached the back side of the cabin, I pressed myself against the cold wood siding and listened. The garage was only a few yards away, a long rectangular structure with warped wooden panels and a single yellow bulb that flickered above the door like it was dying. The night air was sharp against my skin, the kind that carried sound easily. If they were discussing anything sensitive in there, I had a chance of hearing it. I took slow steps toward the garage, staying in the shadows where the porch light did not reach. When I was close enough, I crouched beside the wall and listened to the low rumble of male voices on the other side. I recognized Derek's voice, first strained and shaky, the way he sounded when he was begging. I inched toward a small gap between two boards in the siding and peered inside. The rototiller that had drowned out the earlier conversation was now silent, pushed to the corner like an afterthought. A lantern hung from a hook, casting uneven light over the space. Derek stood near the workbench, rubbing his forehead with both hands like he was trying to hold himself together. Raymond stood across from him, arms folded, jaw clenched, radiating irritation. Ethan leaned against a shelf, looking pale and tense. But what made my blood run cold were the two strangers standing in the middle of the garage. One was tall, with a shaved head and a biker vest, tattoos creeping up his neck. The other wore a dark jacket and had the cold, detached expression of someone used to dealing with fear. They were the kind of men who did not need to raise their voices to intimidate a room. The man with the tattoos spoke first, saying the club had been patient long enough. He reminded Derek that debts had deadlines and that they did not extend charity to people who wasted their time. Derek stammered that he knew that he understood that he just needed things to happen smoothly. The other stranger said it did not need to be smooth, it only needed to be done. The words made my stomach twist. Derek said she is 18 now. No one will ask questions trying to sound confident, but his voice cracked. Raymond stepped in and said she was stubborn but manageable and that they would deliver her before midnight. Ethan muttered something about Sophie hearing about this and losing her mind, but Raymond cut him off with a look that shut him down instantly. The tattooed man laughed under his breath and said they did not care about family drama. They cared about payment. He said transportation would arrive shortly after midnight. He explained that once they delivered me, their debt would be wiped clean and there would be no reason for the club to bother them again unless they were stupid enough to owe more. Then he leaned closer to Derek and said, "A girl that age fetches a decent price even better when she is not tied to anyone who will come looking." My hands shook so violently I had to press my palm over my mouth to keep from gasping. Hearing them talk about me like merchandise made something primal flare up inside me, something between terror and rage. And then the second stranger, the one in the dark jacket, said something that hollowed me out completely. He said this is not the first time the Mitchell family delivered a problem, which snapped my attention so sharply I almost jolted forward. Derek looked down at his boots. Ethan swallowed hard. Raymond smirked like he was proud of a secret that had finally been acknowledged. The stranger added that the club still remembered how the Mitchells handled the woman years ago and appreciated the loyalty. My mother. That was the only woman who fit the timeline, the only woman whose death never made sense. The room spun for a moment, and I had to brace myself against the outer wall to stay upright. My mother had not slipped in the bathroom. Something happened to her. Something planned. Something connected to these men. Something connected to my family. I clenched my teeth so hard it hurt, trying to stay silent. Derek suddenly slammed his hand on the workbench and shouted that he was doing his best, that this was tearing him apart. The tattooed man stepped closer and said if Derek's best did not produce a girl by midnight, their whole family would be dealing with consequences they were not prepared for. Raymond growled that they would have me ready and that Derek needed to toughen up. Ethan finally spoke loudly enough for me to hear clearly. He said, "I do not like this, Dad. She is my sister." Raymond snapped that I was nothing but a burden and that Ethan needed to grow up and understand that sacrifices are necessary when men owe debts. Derek whispered something I could barely hear, something about having no choice, about being threatened, about being out of time. The strangers moved toward the door, their footsteps heavy, and I panicked at the thought of being caught outside. I ducked low and scrambled behind a stack of firewood just as the garage door creaked open. The two men stepped into the yard, lit cigarettes, and talked casually about the route they would take after pickup, as if they were planning a delivery of lumber rather than a human being. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stayed perfectly still. When they re-entered the garage, Raymond shut the door behind them and muttered to the others that everything needed to be ready. Derek said he wished there was another way. Ethan said he could not look at Ella without thinking about what they were doing. Raymond hissed at him to shut up before he ruined everything. I backed away from the firewood slowly until I reached the corner of the cabin. My legs felt numb. My breath shook in my chest. Everything Ella heard was true. Everything I suspected was real. They were not only planning to hand me over tonight, they had been part of something like this before. And now I had less than a few hours to find a way out before I became the next Mitchell woman who disappeared without answers. I crept back toward the cabin with my pulse thundering so loudly I was afraid the men inside would hear it through the walls. Every step felt like walking across cracking ice, and for a moment I wondered if my legs would simply give out from shock. The truth I had just witnessed in the garage clung to me like smoke. They had planned this. They had traded someone before. They had killed my mother or delivered her to the same people now waiting for me. And they were doing it again because debts mattered more to them than blood. When I slipped back into the hallway, the house felt even darker than before, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets. I pushed open my bedroom door and found Ella sitting exactly where I left her, clutching her stuffed rabbit so tightly her knuckles were white. She rushed to me the moment she saw my face and asked in a whisper what was happening. I had to kneel and take her hands to steady both of us. I could not tell her everything, not yet, but I told her we needed to stay quiet and we needed to be smart. She nodded with the solemn bravery only children seem to have, the kind born from surviving things they never should have seen. Then she said she had something she needed to show me, something Grandma once told her about. I felt my stomach clench because the last thing I expected that night was help from a woman who had been dead for years. Ella pointed to the old wooden chest under my bed, a chest I had avoided for most of my life because everything inside belonged to my mother. The lid creaked when I opened it, releasing the faint smell of lavender that had been trapped inside for years. My hands trembled as I lifted out a thin notebook with flowers pressed into the cover, one I recognized immediately. It was my mother's journal. Beneath it were loose papers, folded letters, and a small business card so worn the ink had begun to fade. The name printed on it read Marilyn Carter, with the title Retired Police Sergeant beneath it. I stared at the card confused until I found an entry in the journal written only a few weeks before my mother's death. She had written that she no longer trusted Derek and Raymond, that she feared they were involved in something dangerous, and that she planned to leave soon. She wrote that if anything happened to her, I should find Marilyn. The words hit me like a physical blow. My mother had known they were capable of hurting her. She had known something was coming. She had tried to protect me even when she could not protect herself. As I read her neat handwriting, memories rose in my mind like ghosts. Her hushed warnings, her urgency, her fear, all the signs I had been too young to understand. Ella squeezed my arm and whispered that Grandma once told her the cabin had places built to hide people during emergencies. I looked at her stunned because my mother had never said anything like that to me. Ella said Grandma told her women in this family needed to know where to hide because the men never changed. My throat tightened painfully. I flipped deeper into the journal and found a page with a hand-drawn sketch of the cabin's layout. Beneath it, my mother had written about a space under the floorboards originally designed for winter pipes and wiring, but large enough for a person to crawl through if they needed to. She had circled 2 access points, one near the shed outside and one hidden inside the cabin. I knew instantly that this was the kind of lifeline she hoped I would find. I heard footsteps in the hallway, then heavy and slow, the steps of someone checking rooms or looking for me. I closed the journal and shoved everything back into the chest, sliding it under the bed as quietly as possible. Ella climbed onto the mattress, pretending to be asleep while I flicked off the lamp and sat beside her holding my breath. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. Light from the hallway leaked beneath the frame, a thin yellow line cutting through the darkness. A hand pressed against the handle. I felt my entire body tense. After a few long seconds, the hand disappeared and the footsteps faded. When the silence returned, I leaned close to Ella and whispered that Grandma was still helping us even from wherever she was now. She nodded, tears in her eyes, but her jaw set with determination. In that moment, I realized that in a house filled with men who had chosen violence, the only people I could trust were the women who had survived it. My mother had left clues. Ella had brought them to me, and now I had a thread of hope to follow in a night where every other path led to danger. Once the footsteps disappeared and the house returned to its thick, unsettling silence, I knew I could not wait any longer. The journal, the map, and Ella's warning had given me the one thing I needed most that night, which was direction. I whispered to Ella that we were going to try again, that we had one chance to get outside and reach the crawlspace entrance near the woodshed. Her eyes widened with fear, but she nodded with that same fierce bravery she had shown all night. I told her to stay right behind me and not make a sound, no matter what we heard. I cracked the bedroom door open just enough to see the hallway. The lights were dim, and the murmur of the men's voices drifted faintly from the kitchen. They sounded irritated, impatient, growing more restless as midnight approached. I slipped out with Ella pressed to my side and moved toward the back of the house, staying close to the walls so the floorboards would not betray us. I could hear Derek muttering that everything had to be perfect when the club returned. Raymond responded with something about reputation and loyalty, and Ethan said he was going outside to smoke. That last part made my chest tighten because the shed was outside. If Ethan wandered near it, our entire plan would collapse. I quickened my pace, guiding Ella toward the narrow mudroom that led to the back door. It was a short distance from the hatch my mother had drawn on her map. Just as I reached the mudroom, a shadow passed the frosted window and I froze. Ethan's boots crunched over the gravel as he stepped onto the back porch. He leaned against the railing, lit a cigarette, and exhaled toward the tree line. The smoke curled upward like a warning. I pulled Ella against the wall, waiting for any small chance to move again. A minute passed, maybe 2, though it felt like forever. The night was so quiet I could hear the wind shifting through the pines. Then, by some miracle, Derek called Ethan back inside, yelling that they needed him to check the generator. Ethan groaned, stomped out his cigarette, and went back in. The moment the door shut, I pushed open the mudroom door as quietly as possible and motioned for Ella to follow. The cold night air hit us like a slap, but freedom was so close I could almost taste it. We moved quickly across the narrow clearing behind the cabin, our breaths fogging in the dark. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain someone would step outside and shout our names. When we reached the woodshed, I dropped to my knees and began clearing the leaves and dirt covering the hatch. It was exactly where my mother's map showed it, a metal handle built into a wooden frame. Ella crouched beside me, whispering that she would help. I grabbed the handle and pulled, but the hatch resisted at first. The wood had swollen from years of monsoons and snow. I gritted my teeth and pulled harder until it finally jolted open with a soft groan. A wave of cold, stale air rose from the darkness below. I lowered Ella into the narrow space first, telling her to wait on the ledge until I climbed down. As I prepared to follow her, a loud shout ripped through the silence. It was Ethan's voice calling my name. My heart slammed against my ribs so violently I nearly lost my grip on the frame. He shouted again, closer now, his footsteps pounding across the porch. I dropped into the crawl space, grabbed the hatch, and pulled it shut just as his boots reached the clearing. Everything went pitch black. I held Ella close, my breath shaking so badly I was afraid it would echo through the floorboards above us. Through the thin wooden planks overhead, I heard Ethan yelling to the others that he thought he saw something near the shed. Raymond barked at him to stop wasting time. Derek cursed, saying this was exactly why they needed to hurry. Boots crunched across the ground, circling closer, and I tucked Ella beneath my arm, shielding her as best I could in the narrow space. The hatch above us rattled slightly, and I thought for one horrifying second that Ethan was going to open it. But then the generator from inside the cabin roared to life, its violent buzzing swallowing every other sound. I heard Raymond shout something about needing help stabilizing the power line, and Ethan jogged off, his footsteps fading. Relief flooded me so quickly my knees buckled. I turned on the flashlight of my phone, shielding the brightness with my hand so it would not leak through the cracks. The crawl space was tight and narrow, filled with pipes' old wiring and decades of dust. The ground was cold and uneven. We crouched together, breathing quietly. I whispered to Ella that we had done it, that we were hidden, that no one knew where we were. She clung to me, her small body trembling. Above us, the men resumed arguing, their voices muffled but frantic. The generator noise masked any sound we made, creating the perfect cover my mother must have hoped for when she drew that map. I guided Ella deeper into the crawl space, moving slowly on our hands and knees. The space grew even tighter, but it also drifted farther from the house, giving me the first fragile sense of safety I had felt all night. When we reached a small junction where the floor above dipped lower, I turned off the flashlight and let the darkness wrap around us. Ella leaned against me, whispering that she was scared. I told her I was scared too, but fear did not mean we were powerless. Fear meant we were still alive. For the first time that night, we had a hiding place they did not know existed. And for the first time, I felt a thin thread of hope weaving through the terror. The crawl space felt like another world, a narrow throat of earth and wood, where time slowed and every sound above us vibrated through the beams like a warning. Ella clung to my arm as we crouched deeper beneath the cabin, our breaths mixing with the cold, stale air. I checked my phone screen briefly, shielding the light with my hand. It was almost midnight, the hour everything had been leading toward, the hour they planned to hand me over. The generator rattled loudly above us, its motor echoing through the floorboards, creating the perfect cover for our whispers and movements. But even with the noise, tension thrummed through the house so sharply that I could feel it beneath my palms pressed to the dirt. The men were pacing, preparing, anticipating. I could hear their voices drifting through the cracks between the beams. Derek muttered that the club would be here any minute. Raymond snapped that everything needed to look clean, that once they handed me off their debt would be gone. Ethan said he felt sick, and Raymond barked at him to grow up. Their voices rose and fell, muffled by wood and insulation, but still clear enough to make my stomach twist. Then headlights swept across the yard. The glow leaked through the crawlspace vent in long, pale fingers that danced across the dirt. I grabbed Ella gently and pressed her closer to me. A truck door slammed outside, then another, then another. Heavy boots crunched across the gravel. Low voices murmured serious and businesslike as if they were arriving for a scheduled delivery rather than a kidnapping. Derek's voice trembled when he said, "You are early." One of the strangers replied that they like things done ahead of time, not at the last second. Raymond stepped forward, his tone flatter, more confident, saying they had everything under control. The man with the tattooed neck laughed softly, a cruel sound that made Ella bury her face in my shoulder. He said Mitchell families always claim they have things under control right until they do not. My blood ran cold. He was referring to my mother again, reminding them of whatever arrangement had been made years before. The garage door opened with a metallic groan. More footsteps entered the cabin, slower and heavier than Derek's or Ethan's. These men moved like people who worked in shadows who expected obedience. The whole house vibrated as they spread out inside, inspecting rooms, opening doors, scanning the spaces like they were checking inventory. I pulled Ella farther into the darkness, praying none of them thought to look beneath the floor. I could see faint outlines of movement through the slits in the beams. A man walked into the living room and said, "She is not here." Derek insisted I must be upstairs. Ethan protested that he had checked earlier. Raymond growled that no one better be playing games tonight. The tattooed man said this better not be another delay, or your whole family is done. Another stranger said he would search the basement, even though we did not have one. Their boots echoed across the boards above us, creaking and shaking dust loose from the beams. Ella squeezed my arm so tightly it hurt, but I could not tell her to loosen her grip because I needed to hold on to her too, needed to remind myself what I was fighting for. I whispered barely above a breath that she should stay silent and still no matter what she heard. She nodded against my shoulder. The generator sputtered for a moment. My heart jumped into my throat. If it stalled, if it died, the house would fall into a terrible quiet where any tiny sound could betray us. The motor coughed, choked, then roared back to life, shaking the floor above us in a violent rattle. Relief washed over me like a warm wave. The noise masked everything again. Then a sudden thud overhead made Ella jump. A man had slammed a door. He growled that the girl must be hiding. Derek said she had been acting strange all week. Ethan muttered that he thought she had left the house, but Raymond snapped that she had nowhere to go. The tattooed man said, "Check outside then. Check everywhere. If she is not found by midnight, the price doubles." Raymond cursed and stomped across the living room. I could see the shadows of their legs moving around the cabin through the thin light seeping through cracks. The back door opened and slammed. More boots on the porch. They were searching the yard. I held Ella tighter, wishing I could shield her from all of it. Men shouted commands. One said, "Look near the shed." My heart stopped. The hatch was near the shed. Footsteps approached. Gravel shifted. Leaves rustled. A flashlight beam swept across the yard, glowing faintly through the crawlspace vent. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying they would not see the disturbed leaves around the hatch. The generator continued its metallic roar, drowning out our panicked breathing. A man muttered that he did not see anything. Another said, "Check the garage again." Their voices drifted farther away until the footsteps faded back toward the cabin. I let out a breath I had been holding for too long, but the danger was not gone. They were still inside. They were still searching, and midnight was seconds away. The tattooed man demanded someone bring him a drink while they waited. Derek scrambled to obey. Raymond paced like a caged animal, muttering curses under his breath. Ethan said he needed to sit down. The stranger in the dark jacket told him to stand up straight and act like a man. Then the clock on the old microwave beeped its faint electronic tone. Midnight. A chilling silence fell over the cabin. The men stopped moving. The strangers stopped talking. Even the generator's rumble seemed distant for a moment. The tattooed man said enough wasting time. "Bring her." Derek stammered that she would be here any second. Raymond growled that they would find me. Ethan whispered something that sounded like "I am sorry," but I could not be sure. The men split up again. Their footsteps shook the floorboards like thunder. They were ripping through rooms now, opening closets, overturning furniture, cursing with every empty corner. I tightened my grip around Ella, holding her close as if I could disappear both of us into the darkness. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, a small vibration that nearly made me scream. It was a low battery warning. I turned it off instantly and prayed no light had leaked. Above us, Derek shouted that he could not find me. Raymond yelled that I could not have vanished. The tattooed man snapped that if I was not located within minutes, they would burn the whole house down and sift through the ashes. Ella's breath caught. My throat closed. The danger was closing in from all sides. Midnight had passed. They were out of patience. And I realized with perfect clarity that hiding was no longer enough. Somehow, some way, I needed to find a way to escape the crawl space and the cabin grounds before the men lost control completely. Because the moment they chose fire as their next threat, the crawl space would no longer protect us. It would trap us. And if the cabin burned, so would we. From the crawl space, the world above us erupted into a violent symphony of anger boots and slamming doors, and I knew instinctively that this was the moment everything tipped from control into chaos. The tattooed man barked that he wanted answers, now that he was tired of games, and Derek stammered something I could not fully catch his voice, trembling like a cornered animal. I pulled out my old prepaid phone, the one I had forgotten I kept in my hoodie pocket, and pressed record without hesitating. The generator shook the floorboards, its thundering pulse making my hand tremble, but the audio still picked up the shouting clearly. The phone's screen dimmed as I tucked it against my chest, angling it toward the vents above us. Ella clung to my side, burying her face in my arm, but I whispered that she needed to stay absolutely quiet. The girl nodded, hardly breathing. The house thudded with another heavy footstep. One of the bikers yelled, "I do not have time for this," while another snapped, "Check every damn corner." Derek protested weakly that they were searching, that I had to be somewhere inside. Raymond cursed that I would pay for this if I was hiding. My jaw locked. The men were unraveling fast. Every second of panic from them was crisp and sharp on the recording. I knew deep down that this could become the piece of evidence I needed, the undeniable truth that people like Marilyn Carter could use to bring these men down. I forced myself to stay still as another boot crashed against a wall, shaking dust from the beams inches above Ella's head. A biker shouted that they should have tied me up earlier, and that this was what happens when you trust families like the Mitchells. Another said burn the place and sift the ashes because the deadline had passed. My stomach dropped. Ella dug her fingers into my wrist as though she understood exactly what that meant. The generator rattled, masking the small whimper she made. Derek begged them to wait, swearing they could still find me, insisting they were only minutes away. His voice cracked like he was about to lose everything, and in a way he was. The tattooed man shouted that he did not tolerate incompetence, and that if they had to answer to the club for this failure, someone would bleed. Raymond snapped back that they had done their part and deserved more time. Derek shouted, "Do not talk back to them." Ethan muttered something about me always being the difficult one. The arguments overlapped, harsh and frantic, bouncing through the floorboards into the crawl space like a storm with no direction. I moved the phone closer to the vent, feeling my pulse thudding in my fingertips. Their rage filled every inch of the cabin. One biker slapped Derek hard enough that I heard the skin crack. Derek groaned and tried to steady himself. The tattooed man hissed that he wanted collateral if they could not get me. Raymond asked what that meant, voice slowing with fear. The biker replied that they needed something to show the club they were still following orders. Ethan's breathing grew erratic. Another punched a wall. Someone kicked over a chair. Ella squeezed her eyes shut as if trying to disappear. Then came the words that froze my blood. The biker said we should have handled her mother the same way before she started asking questions. Raymond muttered that they had handled her just fine. Derek snapped at him to shut up. Ethan cursed under his breath. My throat tightened. Hearing that confirmed everything I had feared in whispers but never proved. They had killed my mother. The truth hit like a physical blow. I nearly dropped the phone. Every breath felt too loud, too heavy, but I waited still, recording, pushing myself past the urge to scream. Their voices grew louder, more furious. Derek shouted that they did what they had to do. The tattooed man said, "I do not care about your family's traditions or your problems. You owe what you owe. The deadline is gone. Either bring me the girl or we torch this whole piece of junk and start digging in the ashes." The chaos swelled again. Boots stomped up the stairs. A biker yelled that the upstairs closets were empty. Raymond insisted someone had tipped me off. Ethan said someone must have helped me escape. Derek shouted that no one ever comes to the cabin. The tattooed man replied, maybe she had a phone. Derek cursed and said he had taken every phone months ago. The recording captured every second of their panic. I felt a grim, shaky realization settle over me. Their fear was not for me. It was for themselves. They knew the club would not forgive failure. That desperation made them dangerous, unpredictable, more likely to make brutal decisions. Above us, someone kicked over a piece of furniture so forcefully that dust rained into my eyes. A biker shouted that he wanted gasoline from the garage. Another said not yet. Derek begged them to hold off. Ethan muttered, "This is bad," over and over as if he was praying under his breath. The tattooed man asked for matches. Raymond shouted that lighting anything would bring the fire department too quickly. The biker replied that up here it takes them 30 minutes on a good night. We have time. My heart hammered so hard it made my vision blur. The phone recording kept going, capturing the argument, drifting toward a single violent conclusion. Burn the cabin. Burn everything. Ella pressed into me, trembling. I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly, so she could mirror me. The generator sputtered again, but kept running, masking the sounds of our fear. I whispered, barely audible, that we would move soon. She nodded, trusting me in the middle of hell. I kept recording. Every threat, every confession, every reckless promise they made. Because if we survived the night, this audio might be the only way we proved what happened in the dark above us. And if we did not survive, I wanted someone to find the truth in my pocket. The moment the first glass bottle shattered against the cabin wall, the sound vibrating through the beams above us like brittle lightning, I knew the night had crossed into something irreversible. The biker with the tattooed neck had hurled it in a fit of rage, and although I could not see the flames directly from the crawl space, I heard the sudden whoosh of ignition as the alcohol-soaked rag inside the bottle caught fire. The heat radiated downward almost immediately, warming the wood planks above our heads in a way that made my stomach twist. Ella's fingers dug into my sleeve as she whispered a tiny, frightened sound, and I pressed a hand over her mouth, not in punishment, but in desperation. Smoke seeped through the cracks in the floorboards, thin at first, then thicker, like the cabin itself was exhaling the truth of what was happening. The men above us exchanged rapid, panicked shouts. The tattooed biker yelled that this was what happens when people waste his time. Derek scrambled to put out the flames, shouting that it was only meant to scare me, not burn down the entire cabin. Raymond snapped that they had to be careful because the fire department might show up too soon, exposing everything. Another biker shouted that they needed to keep control and that once they found me, they could leave the cabin to burn afterward. The heat intensified. I could feel it crawling down the beams like a living organism. The crawl space was turning into a slow-cooking oven. Smoke pooled thicker, making my throat scratch with every breath. Ella coughed softly before burying her face in my chest. I pressed my sleeve to her mouth to filter the air as best I could. I swallowed the rising panic because if I lost control, she would too. The generator sputtered loudly, its rattling echoing desperately through the floor. Then the house erupted into complete chaos. Heavy blows thudded across the living room, followed by shouts that were more violent now, sharper, unraveling like frayed rope. One of the bikers threw Derek across a table, yelling that the Mitchells had wasted their time. Raymond yelled back that they were doing their part, that I must be close, and that the fire was a stupid idea. The tattooed man screamed that if they did not deliver me within minutes, the club would kill them all anyway. Derek lunged at him in a moment of drunken courage or pure terror, and the two crashed into the wall, rattling dust from the ceiling. Ethan screamed to stop, but another biker shoved him against the refrigerator, accusing him of lying. The cabin shook with each blow as if an earthquake had lodged itself inside the walls. Smoke poured down into the crawl space in thicker waves, now the smell of burning wood mixing with chemicals and gasoline. The flames licked along the floorboards overhead, crackling with hungry pops. In that moment, I realized something horrifying. The smoke detector had not made a single sound. My pulse dropped into my stomach as I remembered Raymond casually removing the batteries the week before, saying the alarm kept going off every time he cooked bacon. Now that single act of arrogance or manipulation meant the fire could grow unchecked. Ella's breath hitched. Her eyes watered from the smoke. I whispered to her to stay quiet and stay close, that we would move soon. But we needed the right moment, the right distraction. That distraction came when the cabin's front window shattered in a burst of flames and the men above exploded into a shouting match. The tattooed biker shoved Derek into a pile of burning debris. Derek screamed in pain. Ethan ran to help him but was punched across the face by another biker who cursed that the family was nothing but trouble. Raymond grabbed his shotgun, cocking it with a metallic click that echoed clearly even through the floor. Someone screamed to put the gun down. Someone else shouted that no one was leaving without what they came for. The room erupted into a brawl. Fists, shouts, wood splintering. The chaos was a gift of terror and opportunity. With the men distracted, I pulled Ella along the crawlspace belly first, pushing her ahead of me. The smoke burned my eyes and lungs. Every inhale felt like swallowing sand. My hands scraped over dirt and splintered wood as I moved us toward the hatch near the shed. The floor creaked above us with violence. Derek shouted that he could not breathe. A biker yelled that they were all going to burn if they did not get out immediately. Someone yelled, "Find the girl one more time." Another shouted, "Forget her, we need to go." And then a punch landed with a sickening crack. More footsteps thudded as men darted for the exits. Flames roared overhead like a thunderstorm of heat. I reached the hatch, fumbling for the latch through the rising smoke. The metal was hot, searing my fingertips, but I forced it open with a harsh grunt. Cool night air flooded into the crawl space, a relief so sharp it almost hurt. I lifted Ella first, pushing her small, shaking body through the opening. She scrambled out into the grass, coughing. I hauled myself up behind her, dragging the backpack with the phone still recording. The cabin behind us was engulfed. Flames shot through windows and out the roof like orange spears tearing into the night sky. Smoke billowed upward so heavily that it blurred the stars. The men inside scrambled, some fighting each other, some trying to get out, all consumed by a panic they had sown themselves. I grabbed Ella's hand and pulled her toward the tree line behind the cabin. The dry brush cracked under our feet as we sprinted into the woods. Smoke chased us like a living creature, curling around the pines, blotting out the moonlight. Heat radiated across my back as the cabin creaked under the pressure of the flames. Behind us, men shouted. Someone yelled, "She is getting away!" Another screamed, "Forget her, run!" A third cursed that the club would kill them if they failed. I did not look back, not even once. The forest swallowed us in its cold arms, and Ella stumbled beside me, coughing and shaking, but still moving. I lifted her into my arms and ran deeper through the trees. Branches clawed at my skin. My lungs burned. But the night air was freedom, and the burning cabin behind us was the past collapsing into ash. Only one thought guided my steps. We were alive. And as long as we stayed ahead of the men and the fire, we still had a chance to escape this nightmare forever. Once we were deep enough into the forest that the crackling roar of the burning cabin faded into a distant, monstrous echo, I finally stopped running. My arms trembled as I lowered Ella to the ground beneath a tall ponderosa pine. We both coughed violently, the smoke still clawing at our lungs. When I could finally draw a full breath without choking, I dug into my hoodie pocket, pulled out the prepaid phone, and unlocked the screen with shaking fingers. The recording timer blinked at me still running. I hit stop and saved the file, staring at the timestamp that showed nearly 20 minutes of pure chaos captured in audio. Ella leaned against my side, eyes, glassy cheeks streaked with soot. She whispered, "Is it over, Aunt Harper?" And I swallowed hard because I did not want to lie to her, but also could not terrify her with the truth. I told her we were safe for the moment, but needed to keep moving. My voice sounded strange, thin, almost hollow. I forced myself to focus and pressed play on the recording, keeping the volume low enough that only I could hear. The first sound that filled the speaker was the generator rattling. The next was Derek shouting that they would find me. Then came the tattooed biker's harsh threat about burning the place down. I listened closely, my pulse thudding in my ears. Every violent word felt like a blade slicing open the truth I had tried for years to ignore. Their voices rose and fell with anger, desperation, fear. I heard Derek call me the stubborn one. I heard Raymond curse that I should have been handled earlier. I heard Ethan pleading that they could still deliver me. Then, a chilling sentence cut through everything. The biker with the tattooed neck said you Mitchells have always been a problem since the last woman started asking questions. Raymond replied with a smug coldness, "We handled her just fine." My breath stopped. There it was. The thing I had suspected for years but never had proof of. My mother's death was not an accident. It was not a fall in the bathroom. They had killed her because she had figured out what they were involved in or was about to. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. My vision blurred as the truth landed on me with the weight of a lifetime of grief. Ella looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes because she must have felt the shift in my breathing. I pulled her against me, hugging her tight, grounding myself in the warmth of her small, trembling body. I had to stay composed for her sake. She whispered, "Aunt Harper, are they going to find us?" And my heart clenched at the fear in her voice. I tucked the phone back into my pocket, wiped her cheeks with my sleeve, and told her no, we are ahead of them now and they are too busy trying to save themselves. The truth was, they might still search, but in their panic with their world collapsing and the cabin burning, we had a chance to outrun them if we moved carefully. But before we went any farther, I needed to listen again. The recording was our lifeline now. I replayed the section where the men argued about the debt. Their words poured through the speaker. "The club wants the girl. The debt is cleared when they take her. Midnight deadline. No girl, no deal." It was trafficking spoken plainly like an everyday transaction. Derek's voice cracked when he said they had no other way to pay. Raymond bragged about calling in favors from old biker contacts. Ethan muttered that I should have just done what I was told. Then came the threat that chilled me anew. The tattooed man said if she is not here by midnight, we torch this place and dig through whatever is left. Another man said the club will kill us if we go back empty. Another punched Derek. Another shoved Ethan. Their unraveling was there in the audio, raw and undeniable. Whoever heard this would know exactly what their plan had been and what they intended to do to me. The recording captured the sound of glass breaking when the fire started and Derek screaming as he fell into flames. It captured Raymond racking his shotgun. It captured bikers shouting to grab gasoline. And then, the most damning part, Derek yelled, "We already killed her mother. We are not doing this again." A biker shouted, "Shut up, old man." The audio crackled as two bodies collided. That line was everything. Proof of the past and the present. Proof of murder and intent. Proof of exactly how deep the danger ran. My chest tightened with a blend of grief and fury. For years, I had been told to let go of my suspicions about my mother. I had been told she slipped in the shower because she was tired. I had been told I was imagining the bruises she hid before arguing with Derek. I had been made to feel like the strange one for noticing the way Raymond watched her like she was property. Now I had the truth in my hand burned into the memory of a cheap phone. I closed my eyes and forced myself to focus. There was no time to break down. We had to move. I wrapped my arm around Ella's shoulders and told her we were going to walk toward the main road. I did not know exactly how far it was, but I knew the direction. I had walked it once when I was younger and angrier and dreaming of running away. Now I was older and angrier and finally doing it with the smallest and bravest girl in the world beside me. I stood up, steadied myself, and helped Ella stand. My legs shook under me, but the fire in my chest held me upright. The recording was safe. Ella was safe for the moment, and as long as we kept moving, hope was still alive. The walk toward the main road felt endless. A silent crawl through the forest where every snapping twig made my heart jolt with the fear that someone had broken away from the chaos to chase us. The fire behind us still glowed faintly through the trees, a burning reminder that everything I had known was turning into ash. Ella clung to my hand, her small fingers cold but determined, her steps uneven but steady enough to keep going. I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening for shouts or engines or footsteps, but the only sounds were the distant crackling of flames and the night wind sweeping through the pines. When we finally reached the gravel road that cut through the woods, my lungs ached and my legs trembled from the smoke and the sprinting. I crouched beside Ella, brushing her hair back from her face, and asked if she could walk a bit farther. She nodded, even though her eyes were drooping with exhaustion. I lifted her into my arms when her steps wavered, carrying her as I moved along the road toward the faint hint of moonlit pavement up ahead. Just as fear began to claw at me again, headlights appeared around the bend. For a split second, panic surged through me, and I stepped off the road, shielding Ella behind my body. But then I saw the driver through the windshield. An older woman with silver hair tied back in a low braid, wearing a flannel shirt and glasses that caught the glow of the dashboard. She slowed down, rolled down the window, and leaned out with a confused frown. "Honey, are you all right?" she asked, her voice wary but warm enough that I felt my knees weaken in relief. I told her there had been a fire, that we needed help, and that men were looking for us. She looked at me closely, then at Ella clinging to my shoulder like a frightened kitten. Without hesitation, she unlocked the passenger door and told us to get in now. I climbed into the truck, and as soon as the door shut, she made a sharp U-turn, driving away from the cabin without asking questions. After a few minutes of silence, she asked my name. I told her Harper, and without thinking, added that my mother used to know a woman named Marilyn Carter. The woman's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and she glanced over at me with eyes suddenly filled with recognition. She asked if my mother's name had been Laura. When I nodded, her expression changed from cautious curiosity to something deeper, a mixture of grief and anger. She told me she was Marilyn. My breath caught. It felt like fate had picked us up. Marilyn said she had known my mother years ago, back when my mom had first confided her fear of Derek and Raymond. Marilyn had been a detective then, working domestic violence cases in Flagstaff before early retirement. She said my mother had come to her twice before she died, worried that something dark was happening inside the Mitchell family. Hearing her say those words was like having the whole world tilt. Marilyn pulled onto a smaller side road, then another, navigating the night with practiced sharpness. She said she would not bring us directly to her house. Instead, she had a small rental cabin she used for victims who needed a temporary place to hide. She told me she would take us there first, assess the danger, and then decide the next steps. She asked if the men who had caused the fire could follow us. I told her they were busy destroying each other inside the cabin. I told her I had proof that they had planned to hand me over to a biker group to pay off their debts. I told her I had recordings. Her face hardened with a seriousness I had only ever seen in seasoned law enforcement officers. She asked to hear the recordings when we reached the safe house. Ella drifted asleep against my shoulder as the truck rolled deeper into the back roads of northern Arizona. When we arrived, Marilyn parked behind a row of thick juniper trees and led us inside a tiny wooden cabin tucked away from view. The inside smelled faintly of cedar and old books. She locked the door behind us and engaged 2 additional deadbolts. She handed me a glass of water and told me to sit, then checked the windows, the curtains, and even stepped outside once more to sweep the perimeter with a flashlight. When she returned, she told me to play the recording. I placed the phone on the small table and hit play. The generator's rumble filled the room, then Derek's voice, then Raymond's, then the biker's threats. Marilyn listened without blinking. When the part came where they mentioned my mother, she inhaled sharply and whispered, "I knew something was wrong back then. I knew it." She asked me to replay specific parts, leaning forward with eyes laser-focused as if cataloging every word. When the recording ended, she leaned back in her chair, exhaled slowly, and told me the truth. I had always known in my bones. My mother had been murdered. The words were a knife and a balm at the same time. Marilyn said we needed to contact someone trustworthy, someone still in the department who had not been corrupted by the biker connections. She told me she had one person in mind, an old friend still working homicide, but she warned me that we needed to move carefully. She said evidence like this was powerful but dangerous because it implicated not only my family, but a violent biker group that would not hesitate to kill to protect their secrets. She placed a protective hand on Ella's back, smoothing the girl's hair as she slept on the couch. Marilyn promised she would keep us safe, that she had kept women safe before, and that she would not let what happened to my mother happen to me. For the first time in hours, I felt something crack inside me. Not fear, not grief. Hope. Real hope. When morning finally broke, Pale sunlight seeped through the blinds of the safe-house cabin, turning the dust in the air into soft, drifting flecks that made everything feel strangely peaceful, despite the storm that still raged inside my mind. I had barely slept, drifting in and out of restless half-dreams, where fire chased me through the trees and my father's voice echoed through the darkness. Ella slept curled against my side for most of the night, one small hand gripping my shirt like she believed I might disappear if she let go. Marilyn stayed awake in the living room, seated in a wooden chair, with her old service pistol resting on the table beside her, the stance of a woman who had learned the hard way never to underestimate desperation. As soon as she saw me stir awake, she offered a tired but reassuring nod. She poured me a cup of instant coffee and said we needed to start making moves before anyone else did. After Ella woke up and ate a small bowl of cereal, Marilyn told her to draw quietly at the table with the colored pencils she kept for other children who had passed through the safe house. Then she motioned for me to follow her onto the small porch where the cold morning air stung my lungs and the smell of pines wrapped around us like a rough blanket. She explained her plan carefully, step by step. First, we needed to confirm whether Derek and the others were alive and whether they had contacted the biker group. Second, we needed to make controlled contact with my father to bait him into incriminating himself further. Third, we needed to loop in a trusted officer who could coordinate an organized takedown without tipping off anyone who might be compromised. She told me the man she had in mind was Detective Ron Alvarez, a 40-year veteran with a reputation for hating dirty cops, and who had once tried to reopen my mother's case after inconsistencies surfaced. He had been shut down by his captain at the time, and Marilyn suspected that the Mitchell family's biker ties had influenced that decision. I listened, nodding slowly as fear and resolve twisted together inside me like two vines competing for space. When she said I would be the one contacting Derek, my breath stuttered. She placed a steadying hand on my arm and told me that this step was necessary because if he believed I was still alive and alone, he would reveal more out of fear of retaliation from the biker gang. She said that men like him always panicked when cornered. She emphasized that we would not be meeting him without protection. She planned to have undercover officers positioned around the meeting point as well as one sharpshooter in case things escalated. When she finished explaining, she asked me if I felt strong enough to make the call. The truth was, I did not feel strong. I felt like someone held together by adrenaline and grief and the weight of truths too heavy for any 18-year-old to carry. But I also knew that if I did nothing, the same men who had murdered my mother would walk free and eventually come for me again. So I nodded. Marilyn dialed the number for me and handed me the phone. My hands trembled as it rang once, twice, 3 times. Then Derek answered with a rasping cough, his voice raw and frantic. He called my name again and again, asking where I was, telling me he thought I had died in the fire, begging me to come home. I told him I knew everything that I knew the truth about the biker debt and the plan to hand me over. I told him I knew about Mom. His breath hitched sharply, a crack of panic leaking through the line. He tried to deny it, then tried to blame Raymond, then tried to shift the story to make himself sound like a victim who had been forced into impossible decisions. I told him none of that mattered. What mattered was that I wanted to meet him, alone, at the city park near the old Veterans Memorial. I said I did not want police involved and that I just wanted to talk. I could feel Marilyn listening carefully, her eyes never leaving my face as she monitored every tone and pause. Derek agreed instantly, too quickly. His desperation came through the phone like static. Once I hung up, Marilyn immediately contacted Detective Alvarez using a secure encrypted line. She spoke with a clipped tone, relaying the situation with the efficiency of someone who had done crisis work for decades. When she told him the Mitchells' names, he swore under his breath. When she told him about the recording, he swore again louder. He promised he would gather a discreet team he trusted and meet us at the park an hour before the arranged meeting. He told us to arrive exactly at the designated time so they could set their positions. After the call ended, Marilyn turned to me and said the hardest part of the day would be keeping Ella safe. She insisted that Ella stay with one of her retired colleagues who lived 2 doors down, a woman named Teresa, who had once fostered children fleeing domestic violence. Before we left Ella with her, I knelt and hugged her tightly, promising I would be back soon. She asked if her daddy would be there, and I told her honestly that I did not know, but whatever happened, she would not go back with him. She wrapped her arms around my neck and whispered to be careful. Her trembling breath against my ear felt like déjà vu, echoing the warning she had given me just hours before everything turned to chaos. After we settled her in Teresa's living room with cartoons playing softly, Marilyn and I drove toward town in her old Subaru. The road wound through the woods, sunlight flickering through the branches in a way that made my chest tighten with a strange mix of dread and determination. Marilyn parked a block away from the park and led me around the back path through a row of trees. Detective Alvarez was waiting with 3 plainclothes officers and a tactical sharpshooter set up in the upper balcony of an apartment building overlooking the memorial. Alvarez was tall with a graying beard, sharp eyes, and a presence that felt steady as bedrock. He shook my hand gently, looking at me with a kind of sorrow that made me realize he had truly cared about my mother. He told me he believed her back then and had never stopped thinking about her case. He said this time he would make sure justice was not buried. Then he guided me to the bench where I would sit testing the angle of the hidden microphone Marilyn clipped to my jacket. He explained where his officers would stand, how they would move, and what would happen if anything escalated. As he spoke, I felt a shift inside me, a quiet but powerful strength rising from somewhere deep, maybe from the memory of my mother, maybe from the hope of finally ending the cycle. When the time arrived, all that was left to do was wait. When the clock struck 11:58, the park felt frozen in that thin, breathless space between night and dawn, the pale sunlight filtering through high clouds in a muted gray wash that made every sound sharper, every movement louder, and every heartbeat impossible to ignore. I sat on the weathered stone bench near the Veterans Memorial, the metal plaque beside me cold against my leg, the microphone clipped beneath my jacket collar humming with the faintest vibration, as if it too could sense what was coming. Detective Alvarez stood far behind me, disguised as a jogger tying his shoe. 2 plainclothes officers pretended to read newspapers on opposite ends of the walkway, and the sharpshooter waited silently on the rooftop balcony of the building overlooking the park. The entire place looked deceptively calm. The wind rustling through the oak leaves above stray pigeons pecking at the ground, children's chalk drawings still visible on the concrete from the day before. I kept my breathing steady, reminding myself to look scared enough to be believable, but not so panicked that Derek would sense something was different. My palms were sweating despite the cold, and my mind replayed every word Marilyn and Detective Alvarez had drilled into me. Do not get close enough for him to grab you. Do not let him walk behind you. Do not break eye contact if he acts unstable. Keep your voice steady. Keep him talking. Let him incriminate himself. The rest they told me they would handle. But no matter how much I tried to prepare, part of me felt like I was a little girl again, hiding behind our old living room sofa while my father shouted at my mother. Part of me felt the ghost of my mother's hand on my shoulder, whispering, "Be strong." So I straightened my back, forced my hands to unclench, and waited for the man who had taken everything from me to step back into the light. When Derek finally appeared at the edge of the park, limping slightly, his clothes dirty, his face bruised, and his eyes wide with the frantic shine of a trapped animal, I felt an involuntary shiver move through my spine. He looked smaller in the daylight than he ever had in the cabin, as if the fire and the collapsing walls had stripped away whatever power he believed he had. He scanned the park, spotted me, and stumbled forward with a weak smile that almost made me sick. He lifted his hands in the air like a man surrendering and said my name with a cracked voice full of forced warmth. I told myself not to stand, to stay rooted, to let him come to me instead of closing the distance. He moved slowly, wincing with each step, and as he approached, the smell of smoke still clung to him, mixed with sweat and desperation. When he finally stood a few feet away, he let out a breath that sounded half relieved, half terrified. He crouched down in front of the bench, palms open in a pitiful attempt to appear harmless. "Harper," he whispered, "please, sweetheart, you have to understand what happened last night was not supposed to go that way." I stared at him silently, letting the emptiness in my expression force him to keep talking. He looked around nervously again, not noticing or recognizing the officers before leaning closer. "The biker guys got out of control. He said they were not supposed to start a fire. They were just trying to scare you long enough for us to figure out a plan." I tightened my jaw, fighting the urge to spit in his face. I asked him what plan he meant. His eyes flickered with something dark, a mixture of shame and resentment. He said it was Raymond's idea that my grandfather had always had contacts with the club and knew they would accept a girl my age as payment for the debt. He kept saying he had no choice, that the men were threatening to kill all of us if they did not get what they wanted. I reminded him that Ella had heard the conversation and that they had said I would not wake up the next morning. He swallowed hard, shaking his head and insisting again that it was never supposed to happening that way. He blamed Ethan, said Ethan panicked and ran when the fire started. He blamed the bikers, saying they lost control. And then he blamed my mother. He said your mother always made things harder. She was going to ruin everything. She was going to turn us in. I felt my nails dig into my palms. My voice trembled with fury as I asked him what he meant by ruin everything. He looked away, then back at me, then away again. Finally, he whispered, "Your mother knew too much. She was talking to people. She was going to take you and leave." Raymond could not let that happen. My stomach dropped as he spoke the words I had dreaded for years, but finally heard with undeniable clarity. I asked him if he had helped Raymond kill her. For a moment, he hesitated and then nodded once, a small, pathetic gesture that shattered something inside me. He whispered it was an accident she slipped after we tried to make her calm down. He tried to make it sound like self-defense, like she had provoked them, like they were the victims of her decisions. The microphone caught every word. My heart pounded against my ribs as if trying to break free. Then Derek leaned closer, his face twisting with fear. He said, "You cannot tell anyone you are alive. You cannot go to the police. The club thinks you died in the fire. If they find out you are alive, they will kill all of us. You have to come home with me. You have to let me protect you." I almost laughed at the twisted irony of that sentence. Protect me. The man who tried to sell me. The man who killed my mother. The man who stood by while Raymond abused everyone in the household. I shook my head slowly. I told him I was not going anywhere with him and that the only reason I had come was to hear the truth from his mouth. His expression changed instantly, the fear in his eyes sharpening into anger. He stood abruptly, gripping my arm too tightly, saying I was not leaving, that he could fix this if I would just listen. The officers tensed. Detective Alvarez shifted his weight. The sharpshooter steadied his scope. I tried to pull away, telling Derek to let go, but he squeezed harder, his fingers digging into my skin as panic consumed him. He muttered, "You do not understand. They will kill me if you do this. They will kill us all." He reached into his jacket with his free hand, and for a split second, everything stopped. I saw Alvarez's eyes widen. I saw the officers rise from the benches. I saw a flash of metal inside Derek's coat. Before I could react, he yanked out a large hunting knife, pulling me toward him as if I were a shield. My breath caught as cold metal pressed against the side of my ribs. He screamed at the officers to stay back, insisting he did not want to hurt me, but he would if they forced him to. My vision shook with adrenaline. I felt the microphone inside my collar shift. Derek's voice cracked as he shouted, "They made me do it." I did not want to hurt her. We had to pay them back. If she had just listened, if her mother had just listened, everything would have been fine. His grip tightened until my arm throbbed. Detective Alvarez stepped forward slowly, his hands raised, speaking in a calm, steady tone that cut through the panic. "Derek, listen to me, son. You do not want to do this. Let her go." Derek's hand shook violently, the knife pressing closer to my rib cage. He screamed, "Do not lie to me." "You are going to shoot me. You are all going to shoot me." Alvarez kept his voice calm. "No one is shooting anyone. You let her go and we will help you. We can protect you from the club. We can keep you safe." Derek's breathing sped up. He muttered, "They cannot protect me. No one can protect me." He squeezed his eyes shut and made a sudden jerking motion with the knife. In that split second, everything exploded into motion. The sharpshooter fired a single shot. The bullet pierced Derek's shoulder with a sharp snap of air. He screamed and stumbled backward, the knife flying from his hand. I fell sideways onto the bench as officers rushed forward, tackling him to the ground. Derek thrashed and kicked and screamed like a man possessed, yelling that it was all Raymond's fault, that the club forced him, that he never meant to hurt me or my mother. Detective Alvarez shouted for cuffs, and within seconds, Derek's hands were bound behind his back. Blood from his shoulder stained the grass. I sat frozen on the bench, my chest heaving, my vision blurring as the adrenaline slowly seeped out of my system. When I finally raised my eyes, I saw Ethan and Raymond approaching from the far side of the park. They had ignored my instructions to come alone, or they had followed Derek out of suspicion. Raymond held a pistol at his side, his face twisted with rage. Ethan looked pale and strung out, his eyes darting everywhere. When Raymond saw Derek bleeding and surrounded by officers, he lifted the pistol, pointing it at Alvarez. But before he could pull the trigger, the sharpshooter fired again, hitting the gun cleanly out of his hand. Officers sprinted across the lawn. Raymond lunged forward, trying to reach for the fallen gun, but another shot shattered the concrete beside him, and he dropped to his knees with a furious roar. Ethan raised his hands immediately, sobbing loudly, begging them not to shoot him. The officers descended on them with swift, practiced movements. Within seconds, both men were wrestled to the ground, handcuffed, and read their rights. The entire park fell into silence, broken only by the echo of collapsing wheels and incoming sirens. And as I watched the three men who had ruled my life through fear finally face the consequences of their actions, I felt something inside me shift irrevocably. I was not afraid anymore. I was done being afraid. In the weeks that followed the confrontation at the park, everything moved with a speed and force that felt almost unreal, as if the world had been waiting years for the truth about my family to finally claw its way out of the shadows. Detective Alvarez took immediate possession of my phone, securing copies of the recording and submitting it to the district attorney's office, along with sworn statements from the officers at the scene and the physical evidence recovered from the burned cabin. The remains of the cabin were cordoned off with yellow tape, and forensic investigators spent days sifting through the charred debris, recovering fragments of accelerant-soaked wood, the shattered glass from the Molotov bottle, the remnants of the generator, and the partially melted shotgun Raymond had tried to fire during the chaos. When they found the bones of our family dog near the back of the house, it became another line in the ever-growing list of cruelty that defined the Mitchell household. Meanwhile, Derek, Raymond, and Ethan were held in separate county cells under suicide watch. They were denied bail due to the severity of charges, their ties to organized criminal groups, and the clear risk of flight or retaliation. Each man tried to save himself in his own pathetic way. Derek cried hysterically during his arraignment, claiming he had been manipulated by his father and the bikers, insisting he had been forced to comply and had never wanted to hurt me or my mother. His attorney tried to argue diminished capacity due to trauma from the fire. The judge shut him down with a sharp reprimand that echoed through the courtroom. Ethan's approach was even more cowardly. He tried to blame everything on Derek, claiming he had never agreed to hand me over and had only pretended to go along out of fear. But when the prosecutor played the audio of him saying, "Find the girl before midnight, then it is done," the courtroom fell silent, except for the sound of Ethan sobbing into his hands. Raymond, however, showed no remorse. During his arraignment, he glared at me with a hatred so cold it made my blood run icy, as if he still believed he had the right to intimidate me. But even he faltered when the prosecutor read the charges aloud. Conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, attempted kidnapping, attempted murder by arson, aggravated assault, accessory to murder in the death of Laura Mitchell. When they added the enhancement for organized crime involvement, his jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw fear flicker across his face. Investigators used the recording to open a broader case against the biker group, and within a month, several of their members were arrested for extortion, racketeering, and trafficking. My family's case became the spark that allowed law enforcement to finally pursue leads that had gone cold for years. Detective Alvarez told me privately that my mother would have been proud. He said she had been brave long before anyone realized it. The trial began 3 months later in a packed courtroom filled with reporters, survivors of domestic abuse, and people from the community who had known my mother and never believed the story of her so-called accident. I had to testify on the third day, walking to the witness stand with my palms sweating and my throat tight. I kept my eyes on the judge while the prosecutor led me through the events of that night, my childhood memories and the details uncovered through the recording. When she asked me what I believed had happened to my mother, I took a breath and said the truth plainly. They killed her because she tried to protect me. A murmur rippled through the room. Derek sobbed loudly from the defense table, his whole body shaking. Ethan kept his head down, unable to look at me. Raymond simply stared ahead, his expression blank, as though refusing to give me the satisfaction of a reaction. The defense attorneys attempted their predictable strategies, claiming the recording was taken out of context, arguing the men had been intoxicated, insisting the fire had been an accident. The prosecutor dismantled each excuse with the precision of a surgeon. The recording was authenticated. Surveillance footage placed the biker's truck near the cabin earlier that evening. Forensics matched accelerants to the bottles found near the burn site, and most importantly, the recording captured Derek confessing to killing my mother, claiming she had provoked them. No jury could ignore that. During closing arguments, the prosecutor looked directly at the jurors and said, "This case is about a family that used fear, violence, and control to rip apart the lives of the women in their home. It ends today. It ends with justice for Harper and justice for her mother." After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdicts. All guilty. Every charge, every count. Raymond received 35 years without the possibility of parole. Derek received 30 years. Ethan received 27. The judge looked directly at me when she delivered her final remarks, saying, "The courage you showed in escaping, in recording the truth, and in testifying is extraordinary. This court acknowledges your bravery." When the gavel finally fell, something inside me unclenched a wound that had been open for years, beginning to stitch itself shut. Ella, who had been kept away from the courtroom until the verdict, came running into my arms the moment I stepped outside. Sophie, who had regained custody of her daughter during the trial, hugged me, then thanked me in a broken voice for saving Ella's life and my own. We cried together on the courthouse steps while camera shutters clicked around us. Justice had been served in the only way the system could offer it. It would never bring my mother back, but it would end the cycle she had fought so desperately to escape. And in that moment, surrounded by people who finally believed the truth, I felt the first real breath of freedom in my entire life. In the months after the trial ended and the men who had defined every dark corner of my childhood were locked away behind steel and concrete, life took on a strange quietness that felt almost unreal. Like stepping out of a storm only to find yourself standing in a world where the wind has completely stopped. At first, the silence felt foreign and unsettling, as if I had spent so many years bracing for sudden shouts, slammed doors, and angry footsteps that my body did not know how to exist without anticipating danger. I would wake in the middle of the night expecting to hear Derek's drunken stomping down the hallway or Raymond's gravelly voice calling my name. But instead, I heard nothing but the hum of my small refrigerator or the distant sound of cars passing on the highway below my new apartment. Marilyn helped me find the apartment, a modest one-bedroom above a bakery on the edge of town, close enough for her to check on me, but far enough from the mountains that I never had to see the silhouette of the burned cabin again. My first night there, I slept on the living room floor because the bed felt too soft, and the idea of being in a closed room made my chest tighten. But over time, I learned to sleep with the bedroom door closed, then with the lights off, and eventually without waking from nightmares drenched in sweat. Therapy became a lifeline. Marilyn connected me with a trauma counselor who specialized in survivors of domestic violence and family-based coercion. In the beginning, I sat stiffly in the office chair, arms crossed, scanning the room for exits the way I had been conditioned to do my whole life. It took sessions before I could speak more than a few sentences without feeling the urge to cry or run. My therapist, a calm woman named Dr. Rowan with gray streaks in her hair and a voice that reminded me of gentle rain, helped me slowly untangle the knots of fear, shame, guilt, and grief that had shaped so much of my identity. She taught me about trauma responses, about how hypervigilance had kept me alive in the cabin but would suffocate me if I carried it into adulthood. She explained the patterns of generational abuse, helping me understand that what happened to me had roots long before I was born, rooted in the twisted norms and violent traditions that Raymond had passed down. She told me something that stayed with me. You survived a war inside your own home. Now you get to build something new, something of your choosing. For the first time in my life, I began to consider who I could become if I were not defined by fear. Ella remained a constant presence. Sophie kept full custody, and the two moved into a small duplex near the elementary school. Whenever I visited, Ella would run to me with that fierce little hug that made my eyes sting every time. She no longer flinched at sudden noises or looked over her shoulder when someone raised their voice in public. She slept through the night again, something Sophie said had not happened in over a year. We carved pumpkins in October, made hot chocolate on the first snowy day of winter, and spent Saturdays drawing pictures of cats and mountains and things she said made her feel safe. One afternoon, when we were sitting on her bedroom floor, with markers spread everywhere, she looked up at me and said, "Aunt Harper, I think you saved me that night." My throat tightened, and I told her the truth. "You saved me first." Her smile was small but bright, and in it I saw the future she deserved. I also began attending support groups at a local women's shelter. At first, I felt like an intruder, unsure if my story belonged alongside women who had endured years of abuse, financial manipulation, or threats from partners and family members. But the more I listened, the more I realized that our stories, though different in circumstance, were bound by the same emotional threads. We understood each other's silences, each other's scars. I found strength in sharing my story, though it took time before I could speak of my mother without my voice fracturing. I discovered that telling the truth was a form of reclaiming power, a way of rewriting the narrative that had been written for me by the men in my family. With Marilyn's encouragement, I applied for a part-time position at the shelter first, doing administrative work, then helping organize donations and resources, and eventually assisting in peer support sessions. The first day I sat in front of a small circle of women to co-lead a session, my hands shook so badly I had to clasp them together. But as each woman spoke, something inside me steadied. I realized that every time I listened, every time I helped someone feel less alone, I was honoring my mother's fight, the one she never got to finish. I also enrolled in community college, using a state program for victims of violent crime that covered part of the tuition. I chose social work with a focus on crisis intervention. The first time I sat in a classroom again, surrounded by other students' notebooks, open laptops humming, it felt surreal to imagine that I had once believed my future ended in a burning cabin. But slowly, lecture by lecture, textbook page by textbook page, I began to build a life that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with choice. Sometimes, when I walked home from class with the smell of fresh pastry drifting up from the bakery below my apartment, I would stop on the street and look up at the sky, letting myself feel the simplicity of being alive on a peaceful afternoon, not hiding, not running, just living. There were hard days too, days when memories ambushed me, when sleep eluded me, when anger surged so fiercely I felt like throwing something across the room. There were nights when I replayed the recording of my father's voice in my head and wondered how a man could look at his own child and see a debt to be paid. But therapy taught me how to navigate those days, how to ground myself, how to breathe through the pain without letting it consume me. Healing was not linear, but it was real, and it was mine. Months passed. The mountains near Flagstaff turned green, then gold, then white again with winter snow. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and painted the sky in soft orange and blue, I sat on the small balcony of my apartment wrapped in a knitted blanket. The air was crisp, and the scent of wood smoke drifted faintly from a neighbor's chimney. I sipped hot tea and closed my eyes, letting the quiet settle around me like a second blanket. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe in my own skin. I thought of my mother, of her laughter, her strength, her quiet determination. I thought of the way she used to brush my hair behind my ear and tell me that the world was bigger than the cabin and the men inside it. I thought of how she fought in the only ways she could, leaving breadcrumbs for me in journals and whispered warnings that I was too young to understand. She had tried to protect me until her last breath, and now, sitting in the fading light of a peaceful evening, I realized that I was finally living the life she had wanted for me, free, loved, unbroken. My phone buzzed with a FaceTime request, and Ella's smiling face filled the screen a second later, her front tooth missing her hair in two crooked braids. She told me about her school day, about the art project she made for her mom, and about how she wanted me to come over Saturday to watch her practice her dance routine. I told her I would be there. As the call ended, I set the phone down and breathed in the cool air, letting gratitude wash over me. The little girl who whispered the truth on my 18th birthday had saved my life. Her courage had been the spark that ignited everything that followed. And because she whispered, I no longer whispered. I spoke. I healed. I lived. The world was finally mine to choose. If Harper's story touched something deep inside you, I want to speak directly to you as we close this chapter. Stories like this are not just fiction for many people, they are memories. They are wounds. They are echoes of nights when someone you trusted became someone you feared. If you have ever lived through a moment when your home did not feel safe or when your voice was silenced by those who should have protected you, please know that you are not alone. So many people carry stories they have never told, stories that still sit heavy on their chest decades later. If this story reminded you of a time you had to stand up for yourself or walk away from someone who tried to break you, I truly want to hear from you in the comments. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. Your survival matters. You never know who might read your words and feel a little less alone because you were brave enough to share. And if you are watching this from a quiet living room somewhere in America, maybe with a blanket over your legs and a cup of coffee on the table, I want you to take a moment and breathe. You made it through things younger you never believed you would survive. That deserves recognition. If Harper's journey made you think of someone in your own life, someone you wish you could help, or someone you wish you could have saved, feel free to share that too. Many viewers here have lived long enough to understand pain resilience and the long road to healing. This community is built on empathy and connection. Before you go, I have 3 simple questions that help this channel grow and help stories like this reach more people who need them. First, have you ever witnessed or experienced family betrayal or domestic violence, even if it was many years ago? Your comment might help someone realize they are not crazy for still remembering. Second, what city or state are you watching from tonight? I love seeing how far these stories travel across the country, from the quiet towns to the big cities and everywhere in between. Third, did this story make you feel something, whether anger, sadness, or relief at seeing justice finally done? Tell me what moment hit you the hardest. And if you want more stories about justice survival and the quiet strength of ordinary people, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Your engagement is what keeps these stories alive and helps them reach the people who need to hear them the most. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being part of a community that chooses truth healing and compassion over silence.